everyone. Thanks for joining today's national call on HoUSed. We're going to give it about another 30 seconds or so just to allow others to join, but we will start momentarily. Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining today's National HoUSed campaign call for universal, stable, affordable housing. My name is Renee Willis, and I'm the Vice President of Field and Communications here at the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and I'll be facilitating today's conversation. On the agenda for today, or on the call today, we'll be joined by Per Olstad with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, who will share a new ERA digital toolkit and soon to be released ERA program locator from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. We'll also hear from Madeline Youngren and Sarah Abdul Hadi from the Legal Services Corporation. And they will talk about the recently launched eviction laws database. We'll also discuss the findings of two new coalition research publications, The Road Ahead for Low-Income Renters and Direct-to-Tenant Payment Implementation. So we'll hear from our research analyst about those two new publications. We'll also get the latest from NLIC's Erase project. We'll discuss how to advance the House priorities through the infrastructure package on Capitol Hill. And we'll also hear from the field and lots more. So today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available after the broadcast. You'll also be able to find the recording at www.nlihc.org/housed. And as time permits, we'll take a few questions. If you have any questions for the speakers, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And so first I wanted to start with a little bit of news before we jump into our speakers. Our President and CEO, Diane Yantel, will testify at a House Select Committee on the coronavirus hearing. It's called Oversight of Pandemic Evictions, Assessing Abuses by Corporate Landlords, and Federal Efforts to Keep Americans in Their Homes. And that's happening tomorrow, Tuesday, July 27th at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. And I'm sure that we'll drop, if we haven't already, drop a link, and there is a link there, thank you. A link to the hearing if you want to stream it. The hearing will address the misconduct by large corporate landlords during the pandemic, including the failure of some landlord companies to comply with the federal eviction moratorium issued by the CDC or accept ERA, or Emergency Rental Assistance. Additionally, the hearing will focus on ERA best practices and what further actions must be taken to prevent a historic wave of evictions this summer and fall. Other witnesses will include Jim Baker from the Private Equity Stakeholder Project, and Jim has been on our national calls before. Renee Solis from the Bakery Ripley, which is administering Houston Harris County's rental assistance program. Katrina Chisholm, an affected renter, and Joel Griffith from the Heritage Foundation. So again, if you have an opportunity tomorrow, take a look, listen in to the broadcast, and you can access the link in the chat. So we're going to move on to our first speaker. I'm very happy, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce today's guest, Per Olstad. Per is a senior advisor with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and he's here to tell us about a new ERA digital toolkit and soon to be released ERA program locator from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Per, thank you for joining us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for having us come join you all. Again, I'm a senior advisor at the Bureau. The Bureau has assembled sort of a cross-bureau campaign team focused on housing insecurity issues brought on by the pandemic. I lead that team, and we do a lot of work on both homeownership and rental issues. I should say at the outset that it's sort of an honor and sort of humbling to be talking to all of you about rental issues. That the Bureau this is relatively new space for the Bureau. And these are issues that many of you have been wrestling with for years, if not decades. So first of all, thank you for all of your work, but also it's honor and humbling to be speaking to you today. Our goal through the housing campaign and at the Bureau writ large is to help connect financially struggling homeowners, renters, and to some degree even landlords with the resources they need to stay in their homes or to stay in control of their finances. The centerpiece, and if you can turn to the next slide. So, oh, sorry, I forgot my disclaimer. I am a representative of the Bureau, but the views expressed here are my own and should not be interpreted as legal guidance. I'm required to give that disclaimer. Okay, next slide, please. The centerpiece of our effort has been an interagency housing assistance portal hosted on the CFPB's website. That's consumerfinance.gov/housing. The interagency portal is designed to have resources to help homeowners, renters, and landlords understand the options and available and the actions they can take to get help. It includes information on behalf of the CFPB, FHFA, HUD, the USDA, Veterans Affairs, and now Treasury with the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. The portal provides that information through videos, plain language, explanations, links to relevant resources, clear guidance on the action steps people need to take to stay in their homes. We can go to the next slide. With respect to the resources for renters, our focus up until July had really been on providing information around the CDC eviction order, how to make use of the declaration form, how to engage their landlord in doing so. But it also includes information on avoiding eviction in general. It's always had information on help getting help paying rent and utilities, but now that set of resources has become the top priority for the housing portal on the renter side. It includes information on tenant and debt collection rights, the CARES Act protections that are still relevant, and just how to get help from local experts like housing counselors who are staffing up to provide rental assistance or rental housing counseling, and legal services attorneys. Again, in July, we shifted the focus to be more on the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, as that has been ramping up and the state and local programs have becoming live themselves. If we could switch to the next slide. We started with a set of resources aimed at providing essentially a consumer-facing plain language version of the guidance that Treasury had on its website. As Treasury would tell you, that guidance was very explicitly focused on the grantees through the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, and was not intended to, nor was it very useful to individual renters trying to make sense of the program. So the resources that we published on the Bureau site were intended to fill that gap, to explain what the Emergency Rental Assistance Program is, how people can access it in their communities, program eligibility and coverage. This Wednesday, we are supplementing the existing information on the website with the launch of a new rental assistance finder tool. That tool, much like the tool on the NLIHC website already, will help connect renters and landlords with the state and local programs in their area, as well as tribal programs sponsored by the tribally designated housing entities. First, I want to pause and just again offer a huge thank you to NLIHC. Any tool like this is only as good as the data underneath it, and we are very much relying on the data pulled together and maintained through massive effort by the NLIHC team, as well as the team at Treasury and the United States Digital Service. It very honestly could not function without the work that that team has done, so we are extremely grateful for their efforts. Going to the next slide. And by the way, I'm speaking quickly to try and get through this. I know there's a packed agenda, but if there's time for questions, I'm happy to take them. We also just recently launched a set of resources aimed at landlords, especially the smaller landlords who often do not have the resources that the larger corporate landlords do. That includes information on recovering rent through rental assistance programs, but also tips on effective communication between landlords and tenants, guidance for exploring forbearance options for those landlords who are still paying their own mortgage. Our goal in providing this resource is both to provide support to the landlords themselves, but also, especially the smaller landlords who may be relying on that income to pay for their own mortgage or for other bills. We know through our Office for Older Americans at the Bureau that a large number of smaller landlords who are older rely on the income stream from their rental payments as a source of retirement security. But in addition to providing this resource to help the landlords themselves, the landlords continue to play a critical role in tenants accessing rental assistance funds. So in part, we are providing these resources to help dispel myths and encourage and facilitate landlords' participation in the rental assistance programs. The next slide. Now, our website, the housing portal, is available in 7 languages. That includes traditional Chinese, Spanish, Vietnamese, Korean, Tagalog, and Arabic. That includes all of our housing portal pages, but also the other COVID-19 resources we offer. We offer COVID-19 resources on a range of consumer financial topics. We do also have most, though not all, of our video content available in Spanish. Unfortunately, we are not able to offer the video content in all 7 languages, but we do have the video content in Spanish and English. And then next slide. And the last but not least, I just wanted to flag, we already have sort of a broad-based toolkit of media that organizations can use to push out messaging around housing insecurity. On Wednesday, along with the launch of the Rental Assistance Finder tool, we will also be launching a toolkit specifically focused on rental assistance issues. So that includes draft email content, draft social media content for blurbs that could go into a newsletter, content that could be used to put on a website to link to the resources, printable handouts that could be shareable for in-person connections, and a range of other resources that any organization could use to help push the word out. Where we know that with the expiration of the CDC moratorium, it's sort of, it has been for a month, and it is especially true sort of now or never. We need to really get the word out. It never is misleading because we will keep getting the word out after July 31st. But the entire federal government is gearing up for a massive push in the remaining days up until July 31st and beyond. We will continue to update the resources that we offer through the toolkit, both on rental assistance and on other topics. If you have any questions about how to use the toolkit, please contact us at cfpbpress@cfpb.gov. Again, that's cfpbpress@cfpb.gov. Also, just flag, as I did at the White House Summit last week, we also greatly appreciate your feedback, positive or negative, on any of the resources we offer through the housing portal. So if you see things missing, if there's some way we could be more useful in the resources we're providing, please let us know. You can use the same email box for that sort of feedback. And in closing, these are challenging times, and we have millions of people who have been affected and are already facing housing insecurity challenges or have already lost their housing. And we are very concerned about the risk of millions more facing that challenge. We know that the tools are there. The rental assistance programs are now functioning better. They can function faster. We all know that, and we're all pushing to have that happen. But we also know that there's a critical gap in awareness, that millions of renters and landlords don't know about the options and protections available, especially around rental assistance. So whatever we can do to increase awareness of those resources, we are committed to doing. And if there's any way that we can work with you or enlist you in providing that help, please let us know. With that, I know we're, again, packed agenda, so I will stop. But if there are time for questions now or later, I'm happy to take them.
Yeah, thank you, Per. We actually do have a few questions that came in. So one question is, it says, given its centrality to building sustainable communities, how can we help ensure that this new function at CFPB is staffed, resourced, and sustained for the next 4 years?
Great question. I think it's important for the Bureau to hear from you all who have been practicing this area for so long about the critical need for this sort of support. I think I've heard the White House speak about the need for a broader federal infrastructure around eviction prevention. And I think it's important for that narrative to continue. And I think for the Bureau to, I mean, we will obviously hear about it as well, but I think sharing the sort of the depth and scope of that need directly with the Bureau is always useful. But I mean, that said, we will do our own part internally. I don't mean to put it back on all of you. We are committed to continue these efforts. There is no plan to just put this up and then let it expire shortly. We will continue iterating on the tool over the weeks and months to come, and the years to come. I think as long as the need is there, we intend to keep engaging.
Great. We have another question from one of our partners. Someone says, today is the 31st anniversary of the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA. Yet people with disabilities of all ages are still likely to be poorly housed, unhoused, uninstitutionalized, or institutionalized. What are you doing to address these life and death access issues?
Yeah, another good question. We are all along, the Housing Insecurity campaign has been very focused on providing resources across the board, but really trying to be as targeted as we can to those communities we know are in greatest need. And from our perspective, I think we would say that includes communities of colors, it includes limited English proficient consumers, it includes rural and tribal communities, but it also includes people with disabilities. I would say very clearly, we will take any and all suggestions on how to do that most effectively. We have no sort of pride in assuming we know the best way to do that. So we would really appreciate any thoughts you have on how we can do that most effectively. The Bureau is a very small federal agency, and our ability to reach, especially harder to reach communities directly, is limited. We are going to be launching a series of PSA campaigns around this issue and on the homeownership side as well. In the coming weeks, we've already actually started doing some trial, sort of limited scale messaging, just to sort of verify that the messaging we're using actually is effective and does help connect people to the resources they need. I think those PSA efforts will only partially get there, especially for reaching at least certain parts of the community of people with disabilities. But really, any guidance, any thoughts you all have on how we can do that more effectively would be greatly appreciated.
Wonderful. Thank you, Per. Thanks for joining us today. We really do appreciate the wealth of information you provided. And everyone, take a look at the chat area, because there are a number of resources and links there for you. But again, Per, thank you so very much for joining us today. All right, so we're going to transition and move into, or let me introduce our next speaker, Madeline Youngren and Sarah Abdelhadi. And I do apologize if I mispronounced your last name. Thank you so much. So Madeline and Sarah are from the Legal Services Corporation, and they're joining us to tell us about a new eviction laws database. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Next slide, please, or first slide, rather. So as Renee said, my name is Sarah Abdelhadi, and I'm here with my colleague, Madeline Youngren. We are with Legal Services Corporation. We are part of the Office of Data Governance and Analysis. Next slide, please. So for those of you who may be unfamiliar with LSC, we have a really scary sounding name, but we do pretty cool work. We are a nonprofit that was founded by Congress back in the 70s to provide funding to legal aid organizations across the country. So we currently fund 132 independent nonprofit legal aid orgs working across the country, all 50 states, DC, as well as in US territories and a handful of independent states. And if you want to learn more about us, you can check out our website. Next slide, please.
Awesome. So the eviction study that we're speaking on today is a congressionally mandated study to investigate the unmet legal needs surrounding eviction in the United States. It focuses on evictions as a legal process and identifies the scope of unmet legal needs involving eviction at both the state and local level. The study uses a multi-site comparative approach to explore exactly how variations in eviction laws and legal services affect the prevalence of evictions at the local level. And the study is set to conclude in December of 2021. And you can see more on the project page that we have. Next slide, please.
So today we're just going to give you a preview of some of the new tools that we've released so far in this study. The first of which is the Eviction Laws Database, which we're really excited about, just rolled out a couple of weeks ago. And we hope that this will help anyone who is really interested in looking at eviction laws across the country. We collaborated with the Center for Public Health Law Research at Temple University's Law School to put this together. And it consists of two different components. There is a state and territory data set, which covers eviction laws and procedures effective as of January 1st of this year for all the states and territories, as well as a handful of the independent states that are served by LSC grantees. This is really exciting because, to our knowledge, this is the first database to include eviction laws on territories and independent states. So some exciting representation there. We also have a second data set that is at the local level. So this includes not only state and territory laws for the selected sites, but also laws at the county and municipal level. So we worked really hard to pick a selection of 30 locations across the country that we felt were fairly representative based on a number of demographic, socioeconomic, and legal characteristics that we looked into. And if you're interested in finding more about that, you can see our methodology on the website. Next slide, please. So just to give you a quick glimpse of what the data sets look like, this is just a screenshot of the state and territory level data set. You can see on the right side, there's a map, and on the left side, there's a list of questions. So we worked with our partners at Temple to put together a list of coding questions that cover the entire spectrum of the legal process of eviction. So from the very first question, is there even law governing the eviction process? Just a little spoiler alert, there's actually a couple of places where there is no residential eviction law, all the way to the end of the process after evictions have taken place. So you can one way to explore this, it's a very interactive tool, but one way to explore it is to just click on the answer to one of these questions that are listed, and the map will filter for the states and territories where that answer applies. Next slide, please. So another way you can look into it, and this shows the local data set, is you can see profiles for the jurisdictions themselves. So this screenshot shows you the profile for Charleston, South Carolina. And if you click on the little link next to the answer to one of the questions listed, you can actually see an excerpt from the state and territory or county or municipal law that answers the coding question. So everything's included right there. You can explore via the tools, or you can export the data and use it in your own research. And we hope it's super helpful for you. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Sarah. So this is our tracker tool. It's a separate tool that we're also excited about that you can find at lsctracker.org. This tool is evolving as we verify the court data that we're scraping on a regular basis. When you first get to the tracker, you'll see the summary page. It includes a bit of information about the study and provides a link to the eviction study webpage. You'll see an overview of available states and counties that we have for for exploration. We currently have 550 counties in 19 states. The states marked in orange are the states we have with available counties. Next slide, please. So you can work this drop down to see how many counties are available in a particular state and how many filings have occurred in those counties since March 16th, 2020, which was our scraping start date. Here's South Carolina, for example. So we have Charleston and Greenville counties available for analysis. And if you click the Explore Trends button, it will lead you to the page on the next slide. Next slide, please. Thanks. So this is the Trends in Evictions Filings page where you can select a state and county. Here we have the South Carolina example and Charleston is selected. We can see demographic information as well as monthly filings during the COVID-19 pandemic measured as a % of historical averages. And when we scroll down further, we can alter the date to see the number of filings in a particular time frame and look at the weekly filings count. The weekly filing graph shows whether or not there was a state moratorium in place, and you can observe trends accordingly. For states where we have all counties, you can select and observe statewide numbers from the dropdown at the top as well. So that's a very basic overview of how you can use the tracker, and we're happy to answer questions if you direct those by email to datateam@lsc.gov. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. We received a lot of comments coming through saying that your tracker is very cool. And we did receive a lot of requests for the link. So if you take a look at the chat function, the links to the tracker are posted there. So you'll be able to find that, as well as the study that Madeline and Sarah also talked about. You can find links to that in the chat. So thank you so much, Madeline and Sarah, for joining us today. I really do appreciate it. Have a good one. All right, so we're going to move into, we have two of our research analysts, Dan Threet and Emma Foley, who are going to talk to you about two new reports that we just released. The road ahead for low-income renters, and also direct to tenant payment implementation. I believe we're going to start with Dan.
Thanks, Renee. Afternoon, all. So last week, we released a short research note titled "The Road Ahead for Low-Income Renters." You can see the cover of which on the next slide here. Great work by our graphic design team, by the way. And this note summarizes and brings together into one document key things we've learned from public surveys and the research of colleagues, partners, and friends about how low-income renters have fared during the pandemic, and concerns about what that means for the coming months. There are a few reasons to really release a note like this right now, not least because we're approaching an inflection point, potentially quite harmful one as the CDC eviction moratorium comes to an end. And it's more important than ever to be able to speak to the current needs of low-income renters when making the case for further action to legislators, local officials, and others. And given the extent to which we've relied on the Census Bureau's Household Pulse survey over the last 16 months, and some of the difficulties involved in trying to present and translate those survey results into national estimates, we wanted to share a short resource that others could use as well. So this note covers a few topics. Of primary interest is the analysis of the Census Bureau's Household Pulse survey data, some of which reflects the most recent results from surveys implemented between June 23rd and July 5th, and some of which takes a longer view of renters' experiences during the entire pandemic. And as you can see on the next slide, we estimate that as of early July, about 15.5% of renter households, or about 6.5 million households all told, were not caught up on rent. Most are lower income, earning less than $35,000 a year. About 2/3 are in states that, to our knowledge, have no additional eviction protections beyond the end of the CDC eviction moratorium. Of those who have fallen behind on rent, about half expect to be evicted within the next 2 months. The Pulse might well underestimate the share of renter households behind, given that it's still a new survey in some sense, and there are no exactly comparable pre-pandemic survey data on these issues. There are still open questions. But as you can see from this trend, the number of delinquent renter households climbed in late 2020 and fell a bit in early 2021, perhaps as economic impact payments and tax refunds enabled people to temporarily catch their breath. But the share of renters behind on rent has not fallen significantly since March. And many of these households will still be waiting for emergency rental assistance when the moratorium ends. The Pulse data also confirm that renters of color, which you can see on the next slide, as well as renters with lower educational attainment, are more likely to have fallen behind. Low-income renters are also more likely to be behind on their rent throughout the course of the entire pandemic. On the next slide, you can see that in the Pulse, it also shows that renters who lost any employment income at any point during the pandemic continue to be far more likely to be behind on rent compared to those who did not, even a year into the pandemic, which suggests that for many, even a short economic shock could lead to increased hardship even after employment resumes. That may be one reason why, when Pew asked households in January how long it would take them to recover from the harm the pandemic did to their financial situation, about half said it would take at least 3 years to fully recover. We'll be continuing to watch sources like the Household Pulse Survey to gauge how low-income renters fare as the broader economy recovers, assuming we see a continued recovery. In the coming weeks, the Census Bureau will likely be releasing new data about how far behind renters are and possibly on their experiences with emergency rental assistance. My colleague, Emma, has new research on ERA programs themselves, so I'll hand things over to her. But you can see that there is a link here to our report. And if you have questions about the Pulse or other things that are cited in the report, please feel free to reach out to me.
Thanks, Dan. So next, we just wanted to highlight a new research brief titled Direct-to-Tenant Payment Implementation, Increasing Flexibility and Equity in Emergency Rental Assistance Programs. And we touched on this brief last week, but it was released after the call, so just wanted to highlight it and provide the link for you all this week. So the brief aims to provide a framework for how programs can incorporate direct-to-tenant assistance, and it's linked on the first slide, and it looks like Elena just dropped a link into the chat. The brief was largely informed by interviews with ERA program administrators in Maine, Texas, Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, and Cameron County, Texas. The report covers 3 key areas: direct-to-tenant policy, need, and implementation. The first section provides an overview of the U.S. Department of Treasury's guidance and policies related to direct-to-tenant payments. Importantly, Treasury strongly encourages the use of direct-to-tenant payments for ERA1 when landlords don't respond to program requests or refuse to participate. For ERA2, Treasury requires that programs provide direct-to-tenant assistance when landlords do not participate. Next slide. The second section details the need for direct-to-tenant payments. Research indicates that landlord participation is a common challenge among emergency rental assistance programs. And as you see here, a survey conducted by NLIHC, the Housing Initiative at Penn, and the NYU Furman Center found that of early implementers of Treasury's emergency rental assistance, 44% identified landlord participation as a barrier. Given this statistic, providing direct-to-tenant assistance can serve as a bridge to assist tenants whose landlords are apprehensive or wary about participating in the program. Next slide. The bulk of the report details key direct-to-tenant design features with relevant examples from the 4 ERA programs. This section details how these programs implement 6 steps of the direct-to-tenant payment process, as well as considerations for how other programs might incorporate these. The 6 steps include landlord outreach, outreach tracking, program accountability, tenant requirements, making tenant payments, and transparency about direct-to-tenant availability. Next slide. The report highlights several key takeaways. First, programs should eliminate added burdensome documentation requirements for tenants who receive funding directly. In particular, tenants should not have to provide proof of payment that they made the payment to the landlord once they receive assistance directly. Second, programs should make clear on their public documents and program websites that direct-to-tenant assistance is available for tenants with landlords who are unwilling to participate. to ensure that tenants know this assistance is open and available to them. And then third, in addition to direct-to-tenant payments, programs should pair this with housing stability services to ensure that tenants are stably housed after their arrears are paid. For example, if a tenant receives rental assistance but has a hostile landlord that threatens eviction even after arrears are paid, the tenant could benefit from additional assistance or services such as relocation expenses. Next slide. And the report is linked again here. And if you have any questions about the report or about direct-to-tenant implementation, we'll continue to look into this program flexibility, particularly as programs implement their ERA2 funding. And so please do feel free to email me at efoley@nlihc.org. And I will turn it back to Renee.
Thank you, Emma. Thank you, Dan. So we do have a question that came in. Emma, it's directed to you. It says, please let us know how you and coalition leaders will continue to track ERA best and worst models for serving those most in need.
Yeah, definitely. So we at NLIHC are tracking several kind of components of ERA programs. One is program features more generally, and we maintain a comprehensive database of ERA programs and the features that they implement, such as self-attestation and direct-to-tenant assistance. That's also included on our dashboard, which we can link in the chat. And then we also collect data on ERA spending, how quickly programs are able to get funding out the door. And then we compile more qualitative and in-depth information in our research briefs, as well as case studies on specific programs.
Great, thank you, Emma. And one last question. Have programs always been able to give direct-to-tenant payments?
Yeah, that's a good question. The policies have been changing over time. So certainly with the CARES funding, depending on the type of funding source and how programs were implemented, there was a lot more discretion. But since the Department of Treasury has funded the $25 billion plus the additional ERA2 funds, they have made explicit that they strongly encourage the use of direct-to-tenant payments and require it for ERA2. And so we've seen kind of a stronger enforcement of direct-to-tenant payments over time.
Thank you, Emma. That's great. All right, so we are, again, thank you, Emma. Thank you, Dan, for sharing the top line data from both of these reports. And again, if you take a look at the chat area, there are links to both of these reports, so do take a look. We're going to transition to our field updates. So we're going to turn to our partners in the field to hear what's happening in DC, Illinois, and Indiana. And I'll turn it over first to Amanda Kober with the Legal Aid Society of the District of Columbia. Welcome, Amanda.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm just going to talk briefly. I think what folks had indicated they wanted to hear about was a new law that just passed in DC that is an attempt at phasing back in eviction instead of kind of turning on the spigot all at once. And so I will start by giving a little bit of brief background, which some of you may know. In DC, we've had a very robust moratorium on evictions since the beginning of the pandemic and at all phases. So actual evictions were on hold throughout the entirety of the public health emergency, which for DC meant through yesterday, July 25th. The filings on new cases were on hold through yesterday, July 25th, and even serving of like the initial 30-day notice that you have to give prior to an eviction, prior to filing an eviction case was on hold. Landlords weren't allowed to serve those notices. But as of yesterday, our public health emergency has expired and the mayor is not extending it. And so all of those protections expired with it. But a couple of weeks ago, we got a law through the DC Council that is not perfect, but is better than I think what a lot of us thought possible a year ago. And so basically what this law does is for non-payment of rent, tenants have to be given a 60-day, well, first landlords have to apply for our rental assistance program, which is called Stay DC here. So landlords have to apply for the rental assistance program. Then they need to send their tenants a 60-day notice telling them, hey, I've applied for rental assistance, now you have to do your part. If the tenant applies for rental assistance during that period, they can't be sued while their application is pending, or if they're denied while they're appealing that denial. And then if the tenant doesn't apply, or if the tenant is denied or found ineligible, the landlord can file a case starting on October 12th. And then for all other types of cases, so for example, like lease violation cases that aren't based on non-payment, landlords can begin serving those notices, those 30-day notices to tenants at the end of September, and then they can begin filing those in January of 2022. And so and the law includes a lot of other nuance around information that needs to be included in notices. The notices have to include information about legal services available. They need to be served on, in DC, we have what's called an Office of the Tenant Advocate, which is an agency that gives legal advice to tenants. They need to be served on that agency. And so there was an attempt to build in lots of protections for tenants. And like I said, it's not perfect. And part of the reason it's not perfect is because, like many other places, our rental assistance program is not really functioning as it should be. There's a big backlog. Applications aren't getting processed. They're not getting approved. But the idea was that if a tenant could get their application in and it's pending, they shouldn't face a filing for non-payment of rent. And so I will stop there because I don't want to go over time or get too in the weeds. But I'm happy to answer any questions or whatever is useful for you all.
Thank you so much, Amanda. I don't see any questions just yet, but if you can stay on for a little while, we may have some questions to pop in, and if you can answer those, that would be great. All right, we're going to turn it over to Bob Palmer, who is with Housing Action Illinois. Bob, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Renee. So similar to what we just heard from DC, I'm going to talk a bit about how we're phasing out of the eviction moratorium in Illinois. And I have three slides. Here's the first slide. I'll just say as a bit of background that in Illinois, our state moratorium has been very much a federal moratorium in that the tenant has to provide a declaration to the landlord saying, that they're eligible and income, and also that they had a loss of income due to COVID or during the pandemic, and they're making an effort to make at least partial payments and that sort of thing. A couple of ways that it's been stronger, the landlord was actually required to give the tenant a copy of the blank declaration form, and then also our tenant didn't have to figure out that these things exist. And then also tenants who were up to date on their rent, but there was no health or safety violation alleged by the landlord in terms of putting people or property at risk. Those people who are maybe just at the end of their lease, or if the landlord was looking away around the declaration, those tenants who were up to date on rent and just it was a lease non-renewal were protected from eviction. So Governor Pritzker a few weeks ago announced that he was going to be phasing out the eviction moratorium between then and the end of August. So in Illinois, as of August 1, eviction filings are going to be allowed against covered persons again, but there still is, and Governor Pritzker said this at his press conference several weeks ago, there's still going to be a prohibition on law enforcement carrying out evictions through the end of August against covered persons. Then also, very importantly, the governor's office and the state Supreme Court have been in communication, and in mid-July, the Illinois Supreme Court announced an order effective August 1 that basically for covered persons, those cases are going to be stayed for 30 days, and they're going to be referred to rent assistance programs and other resources that are available through the Illinois Department of Human Services, who is contracted with homeless service providers and other social service providers, including those serving immigrant communities around the state to help distribute rent assistance and provide case management. And then there's also legal services available through nonprofit legal service providers around the state. So during that month of August, program or people in eviction court will be referred to those type of programs. And in here, I have a link to the court order in Illinois, and then also access to our link to our Illinois declaration form. You go on to the next slide. These are just some of the resources we have in Illinois. A really good website, IllinoisRentalAssistance.org, that tells people about the different ways to access rent assistance through our State Housing Finance Authority. That website is currently closed for rent assistance, but again, importantly, people can still get rent assistance through the Department of Human Services provider network. We also have evictionhelpillinois.org to access free legal assistance. Some counties have ERA programs that are still available. Many counties in Illinois that got their own allocation of dollars actually allocated those dollars to the state of Illinois. So we have a list on our website to help people keep track of that. And then also, and I don't have any details of this at this point, but importantly, there's going to be a new statewide court-based rent assistance program that is going to be starting in August. So people who have cases in court in August will be referred directly through a different application procedure specifically for them, landlords and tenants, to get rent assistance. And then my final slide, go to the next slide, is just some resources in Illinois about how different local governments are partnering with community-based groups are working on their own to prevent evictions. In Cook County, which is the largest county in Illinois that includes Chicago, there's an early resolution program that includes court-based mediation, free legal assistance, and other services. That's available through cookcountylegalaid.org. That's funded with federal and state dollars. A more rural or small urban county in Illinois, out in Rock Island, the Quad Cities near the Iowa border, also has an eviction diversion program. The city of Chicago has an eviction protection ordinance that they just strengthened that requires landlords who received a separate type of notice, a tenant notice of COVID-19 impact that's particular to Chicago, to either register with the city, state, or county ERA programs. So requiring that registration is another way to make sure that landlords and tenants are connected to rent assistance. And then in Cook County, which again includes Chicago, the Cook County Sheriff has established a policy to not allow evictions to be scheduled, even if it's been ordered by the court, if the housing provider certifies, or unless the housing provider certifies they have not received emergency rent assistance with eviction prohibitions, and that there's no ERA application pending. So these are ways that our state government, our governor's office, our state courts, our local courts, community-based organizations, and local governments are working together to keep people housed and prevent as many evictions as possible. And obviously, August is a very crucial month. If we feel like that we need more time, we will appeal to our Illinois court to maintain that stay into September as long as necessary to get people rent assistance. So thanks for having me on the call today.
Thanks, Bob. And let's move on to our last update from the field. So we have Andrew Bradley and Natalie James of Prosperity, Indiana. Thanks for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much, and it's good to talk with everyone today. I'm Andrew Bradley with Prosperity, Indiana. I'm here with my colleague, Natalie James. So we have a little bit of a contrast to talk with you about. Compared to DC and Illinois, you heard a great array of some statewide and citywide efforts. In Indiana, we have some real challenges. We're one of the states that has high eviction rates, has high links to neighborhoods with low vaccination rates. and also really strong statewide preemption of the ability of what some of our cities can do. But what we're hoping to do is to take some of the momentum from the recent White House Eviction Prevention Summit that we were invited to participate in the Indianapolis Working Group, as well as some of the leadership and guidance from NLIHC and the ERASE program to try to provide some momentum for equitable implementation of rental assistance. So really briefly, first of all, Indianapolis and Indiana have had a pre-existing eviction crisis. Indianapolis has the second highest number of evictions of any major US city, according to Eviction Lab, and is one of 3 cities statewide that are among the top 20 for highest eviction rates. So really high numbers and rates of evictions in Indiana, even before COVID. And what we know is that during COVID, Black and brown Hoosiers have been up to 80% more likely to have housing instability compared to white households, and families with children about twice as likely to not be able to make rent as families without children. So given that, we know that evictions cause long-term economic damage. We've seen those reports saying that damage can last up to a decade or longer. So the stakes are really high. However, Indiana communities like Indianapolis are currently limited by state legislation, including a new really broad preemption bill that prohibits local ordinances involving nearly any aspect of the landlord-tenant relationship. They're really limited from the proactive steps that they can take, even with the end of the moratorium coming up. They are not allowed to produce notification of tenants' rights or programs, eviction sealing or expungement, requiring sediment diversion programs, or other tools that other states like those you've just heard are able to use. New Treasury data is showing that Indiana 7 ERA programs have only distributed about 5.6% of the $448 million allocated to the state. And while there have been higher amounts in some of the city programs, the statewide program reported out only 1.4% allocation rate. And that's lowest amongst all of our neighbors, including our friends in Illinois, and third lowest amongst all Midwest states. So we see those real challenges across the different programs in the states and impacted by this pre-existing crisis and policy structure. So let me turn it over to my colleague Natalie about what we're hearing from some of our partners statewide.
Thanks, Andrew. Over the past few weeks, we've been talking to a number of partners in sectors such as healthcare, economic mobility, and racial equity about how they can contribute to the housing fight in Indiana. And over the course of those few weeks, a few things have come to light. One, the state of Indiana is in desperate need of emergency rental assistance. And two, that ERAT programs in Indiana are not currently working as effectively as they could be to get the funds out to those who need the most. And three, the programs aren't working because Indiana lacks the infrastructure to support the programs. And so finally, we've understood that we need to continue working to make sure that we have a statewide concerted effort so that we don't miss the opportunity to get the funds in the hands of those who need them most. And this has been kind of the fuel behind the conversations we're having with folks from a number of different sectors because everyone's hands kind of need to be in the fight. And this has also been the fuel behind the eviction diversion work. And Andrew will go into more detail about that.
Thanks, Natalie. So that's why we were really excited to be asked to participate in this Indianapolis working group from the White House Eviction Prevention Summit, where there were other housing advocates, but also city officials, some local judges and court officials tasked with finding ways to more equitably distribute emergency rental assistance resources. So what we're hoping to do is to use some of the inspiration from the ERASE program to not only strengthen and support the current ERA program, including with items like a checklist, and work with community partners such as low-income residents and Black, Indigenous, and other peoples of color to make sure that there's targeted outreach and implementation of those resources, but also then to try to connect it with the local court system. We're exploring options to be able to include ERA tables within local courts to make sure that residents, if they come to court are able to apply in person and hopefully be expedited in that process, and also explore ways to make sure that they're connected with other recovery resources like nutrition assistance, workforce development, and tenants' rights. And then also to look for ways to have actual in-court representation in ways that aren't currently available, using some recovery resources as well. So the framework that we produced includes those elements, and also we're trying to make sure that we're capturing data from the programs themselves, and to be able to make changes and course correct where we need to. And perhaps most importantly, while this particular working group was targeted at Indianapolis, we want to use this framework to scale up statewide, so that hopefully we're able to reach all Hoosiers and help ensure that no one is left out of a stronger, equitable recovery statewide. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Natalie, so much for that information. I don't see any questions for you directly, but if you can hang on and answer any questions that pop in, that would be fantastic. I do see a lot of comments about the field presentations. People are saying that this information is extremely helpful. Also, Andrew and Natalie, there's a comment here saying that we're inspired by leaders struggling where opposition is incredibly strong to the disadvantage of too many in need. And they're saying also that you're in the front line and labor under great duress. Please know that your mighty struggle is central to building back better. And there are a couple of comments too, Bob, if you can post some of the links, if you can share your slides. But we will be sharing information and slides after this call for everyone, so do stay tuned for that. But thank you, Field, for those encouraging reports. We really do appreciate you. All right, we are going to move on now to Sarah Gallagher, who is the Senior Project Director of ERASE, which is end rental arrears to stop evictions. So Sarah, hopefully you are on this call. I think I do see you, and thank you for joining.
Hi, thank you. Thanks, Renee, and thanks everybody for all of those wonderful updates. It's so exciting to always hear what innovative work is happening in the field. So we really appreciate it. I will be quick today. I just wanted to, my role is to remind everyone that our webinar series, our RACE webinar series, is kicking off this week on Wednesday. I think our slides might be a little bit out of order. So if we could just fast forward to the webinar slide. There we go, the webinar series slide, that'd be great. So as a reminder, this is the part one of the three-part series that really focuses on our RACE call to action that actually was just mentioned. So our first webinar is on ensuring equitable outreach, marketing, and targeting of emergency rental assistance. And it'll be on July 28th from 3 to 4:30. I think the link is in the chat to register if you haven't already. And if you register one in the series, you actually are registering for them all. So no need to go in and register for each one individually. And we're gonna have some great speakers with us on Wednesday, from Barb Poppy to Samantha Badio from Urban, and then lots of folks from the field to talk about their experience. Peggy Bailey from HUD will be moderating that session for us, so it's gonna be fantastic. Next week, we'll have a session on accessible, creating flexible, streamlined, and low barrier application processes. And then on August 11th, we're going to focus on preventive, connecting emergency rental assistance to courts and tenant protections. So please join us and let me know if you have any questions or comments on the webinars, and we will be recording them. So if you can't join us on any one of those days, just look for the recordings and we'll share those widely. So thank you, and I'm going to turn it over to Emma.
Thanks. I'm happy to be back again, and thanks for backing up the slides a bit. So I'm going to just be talking about some recent data released by the Department of Treasury, updated spending data on emergency rental assistance programs. New data was released last Wednesday on July 21st, and the data reflects spending progress for states and localities through June 30th. Data is available on the Department of Treasury's Emergency Rental Assistance webpage, which is linked in the slide, and maybe someone can link it in the chat. If not, I'll drop it at the end of this presentation. Overall, the rate of spending has increased each reporting period, but the progress is still not fast enough given the fast approaching end of the eviction moratorium later this week. Approximately $3 billion out of $25 billion has been spent so far, representing 12% of total funds. Next slide. This next slide shows the amount of funding that has been dispersed each month and cumulatively since January. Notably, the amount of ERA funding paid out to households has nearly doubled each reporting period. So it increased from $256 million in Q1 to $464 million in April to $766 million in May to $1.5 billion in June alone. The number of households served has also been steadily increasing, with over 84,000 households served in Q1 and almost 300,000 households served in June alone. Since the program started, 633,000 unique households have been served. Next slide. We're continuing to see a gap in how quickly states and localities are able to spend down their funds. States have expended 10% of their funding, where cities and counties have dispersed 20%. For states, this is an increase in 6 percentage points since the end of May. And for cities and counties, this is an increase in 7 percentage points since the end of May. Next slide. And though the rate of dispersal is increasing, it is still not increasing fast enough. For example, only 5 states have distributed over 20% of their funds. As of June 30th, these included Virginia, Texas, the District of Columbia, Massachusetts, and Alaska, though other states may have surpassed this 20% mark in July. Of particular concern as well is that as of the end of June, several states had distributed less than 1% of their funds. These included New York, Florida, Wyoming, Arkansas, and South Carolina. And then finally, though some jurisdictions are making great progress, over 10% of localities, only 10% of localities have distributed over half of their funds. And as I noted earlier, the funding is certainly not moving fast enough, and many households remain at risk due to the expiring eviction moratorium. And here at NLIHC, we will continue to track spending using both Treasury data as well as program-specific data from real-time dashboards to provide updates on spending progress and have those inform best practices. And I will hand it back to Renee.
Thank you, Emma. Let's see, it looks like we may have one question that came in. Someone is asking about, do we know about ERA2 spending, is the question.
Yeah, we have been trying to track where programs might be starting to spend their ERA2 funding, but based on what we found, most programs are still working on spending down their ERA1 allocation. And so this presentation was just in that context. And so all the percentages are just in the context of ERA1 funding.
Fantastic. Thank you, Emma. And we do have links in the chat to, if you want to take a look at the ERA1 data, there's a link there, and also data from the Treasury. We have a link as well if you want to take a look there. So again, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Emma, for that report. Fantastic. All right, let's move on to Sarah Sadian, who is with the coalition. She's the Vice President of Policy, and she's going to provide us with updates on updates and next steps for advancing long-term housing solutions and an infrastructure spending bill. Sarah, welcome.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me. I'm just getting my notes ready. So there is a lot of drama going on around the infrastructure bill, but before I get there, I wanted to just talk a little bit more about Diane's testimony tomorrow before the House Select Subcommittee on Coronavirus. I'm going to ask my colleague Elena if she can share a link to Diane's testimony. I encourage you guys to check it out. It really pulls together the latest and greatest research from our research team, from our policy team, from all across our organization to make sure that we're presenting as strong of an argument as possible for why we need both an extension of the CDC eviction moratorium that's set to expire this week, but also to make sure that we're doing everything that we can to get emergency rental assistance out to everyone who's in need. Other witnesses I just want to note for folks include Jim Baker from the Private Equity Stakeholders Project. Jim has spoken on this national call before and has done really great work tracking, especially large corporate landlords and their practices of evicting people despite the moratorium. Renee Solis from Baker Ripley is going to be there to talk about their administration of the Houston and Harris County rental assistance program. Katrina Chisholm is going to be there. I believe she's an affected renter who's going to speak about her direct experience. And Joel Griffith from the Heritage Foundation will be there. So check it out. I'll also ask my colleague to share a link to where you can stream the hearing tomorrow morning. It should start at 10:30 in the morning, Eastern time. Okay, on to the Rocky infrastructure bill. So there was a lot of drama last week when Senator Schumer scheduled a procedural vote that didn't happen. He's trying to put pressure on that bipartisan group to move forward with their infrastructure agreement. It sounds like things are maybe moving in the direction that it needs to, but it also sounds like this thing could fall apart at any moment. Rob Portman has said that they're about 90% of the way there, but there's a lot of things that they haven't figured out yet, like mass transit spending, water projects, how much to pay construction workers, and what sorts of funding can be used for the pay for. And then they're starting to openly feud about these disagreements in the press, which either could be a strategy to try to move them over the finishing line, or could be an indication that this doesn't get done. Either way, if we're able to see a deal on the bipartisan infrastructure bill, we might be able to get a vote on it as soon as the end of this week. The other things that I've picked up on that I think are really interesting here is one, that Speaker Pelosi continues to say that she will not bring this bipartisan bill to the floor unless the Senate also acts to pass a budget reconciliation bill. It's really important that she's continuing to maintain that line. It means that our ability to get housing investments is increased, but we'll have to see whether or not she sticks with that and how that sort of unfolds. The second thing that I've picked that's new that I think does not bode well for this bipartisan bill is that former President Trump is now campaigning against it and encouraging Republicans not to vote for this bill. So that could poison the well, if you will, and prevent them from reaching a deal. All of this has to get sorted out relatively soon in order for Democrats to move forward with a budget reconciliation bill. So we still haven't seen the budget resolution, which is the initial procedural mechanism you need to move forward. We haven't seen that in part because they're waiting to see whether anything actually comes out of these bipartisan negotiations. And if not, they'll have to include that into the budget resolution. Either way, we know that their timeline is getting shorter and shorter because they really have to vote on this on the Senate floor by the first week of August, which is next week. Not by that first week, but the first week of August, yeah, which is next week, which means that there's just not a lot of time to continue these negotiations. So we'll see how that goes. That means we still have more time between now and then to keep pushing for as high of an allocation for housing in a budget resolution and to keep pressing about how important our top 3 priorities are. And that's expanding rental assistance, at least $70 billion for public housing, and $45 billion for the Housing Trust Fund. I did want to give a word to a couple of other things too. I don't know if you guys can hear fireworks going off in my neighborhood in the background, but it's distracting. Sorry about that. So talk about the waters bills, the 2 bills that she introduced. One is the Housing as Infrastructure Act. This is her $600 billion proposal for what she wants to see in the infrastructure bill. It includes all of our top priorities and gives even then some. It includes $200 billion for rental assistance, $75 billion for public housing, and $45 billion for the Housing Trust Fund. In the last week, we've doubled the number of co-sponsors, which is really great. We now stand at about 55 co-sponsors. I'm going to encourage my colleague Elena to share a link to our Google Doc where we're tracking all of the co-sponsors to this bill. Feel free to check back in with this document as you go on. If you see that your Democratic member is not on this bill, please contact them this week and see if they'll join on as a co-sponsor. The second bill that we were talking about is the Ending Homelessness Act. And this is, as a reminder, the bill that would create a universal rental assistance entitlement program phased in over 10 years, starting with households that have the greatest needs. Again, really major gains in our co-sponsors. We have 51 co-sponsors on this bill now. This is the other ask that we have for you this week, to ask your Democratic members of Congress to sign on. We don't have any expectations that Republicans are going to sign on to these bills, but it's still helpful for you to talk with Republican members about why these housing resources are important. We've talked about this in the past, that engaging with them on this can help blunt any criticism of the bill that might come later on. We don't expect Republicans to vote for this, the final budget reconciliation bill, but engaging with them on why housing is important can help neutralize some of those arguments. Lastly, I wanted to give an update about the FY22 spending bills. The Rules Committee is meeting today to talk about what amendments will be brought up for a vote on the House floor. Sometime this week, the House will vote on a minibus, which includes the Transportation and Housing Programs bill, but also several others. It's probably not super likely that we'll see amendments on the housing spending bill, only because there's a lot of other higher targets, I think, for Republicans this week, but we're going to keep a really close eye on it to see what amendments we'll get a vote on. If we see harmful ones, we'll let you guys know about it. But either way, we expect that bill to likely move forward out of the House. What does that mean? Well, it doesn't really change the dynamics when it comes to appropriations bills and the timing for when we think Congress will finish. The Senate hasn't even started this process yet. We're hearing conversations now about Republicans who might be willing to vote for an end of the year spending bill or an increase to the debt ceiling limit in exchange for reimposing really low spending caps on domestic and defense programs. You might remember that in 2011, Congress had this great idea that they would force Congress to come to a compromise on entitlement reform and reducing the deficit. And the idea of these spending caps were going to be that they're so onerous that no one in their right mind would agree to it. And yet we saw that come into fruition. And for the last decade, we've had these low spending caps that have really made it extremely difficult for Congress to fund housing programs at the level necessary. This is the first year without those spending caps. And so I just want to flag this for you, that we are strongly opposed to any further spending caps being put in place. It really makes it impossible to fund housing programs at the level that's necessary. And so just flagging this for you as you're engaging with your members of Congress, that you'll want to tell them that this is a bad idea and that we should instead be focused on building up these programs to make up for the last 10 years of not having enough funding. So with that, I'll pause and I'll see, Renee, if there are any questions that you'd like me to answer.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sarah. So we have a question that came in, and someone said, thank you for the testimony, for sharing a link to the testimony. But can you distill it down to the 3 most important talking points, because they want to help to amplify the message?
Sure. I mean, when it comes to the Housing as Infrastructure Act, I think the thing to focus on here is that it really prioritizes resources that will make housing affordable for people who have the very greatest needs. And maybe instead of talking about that specific bill, you could focus on the need for rental assistance, public housing dollars, and housing trust fund dollars. I think the other thing that makes it a lot easier for folks to get onto this bill is that there are just about 100 organizations that have endorsed both of these bills. So this is not just an LHC bill or just a bill that's, endorsed by our friends. There are huge numbers of organizations that are really coalescing around this bill, and that they should see it as this is the vehicle for housing and infrastructure investments going forward. For the Ending Homelessness Act, that's a little different. We don't expect this bill to be enacted into law this year. This is really a vision of where Chairwoman of Waters and NLHC and the House campaign think we need to be going. We've talked a lot about how I think what I would emphasize is the fact that because housing's not a mandatory program, only 1 in 4 people who are eligible get any sort of assistance. And that because there are so many holes in our safety net, when the pandemic happened or when other crises happen, it means that there's really nothing to catch people from falling behind on their rent. And the part of the reason why we see so many people who are at risk of losing their homes once this moratorium ends is because we aren't funding these really important voucher program and safety net programs at the scale that's needed. So I usually talk about it in terms of what's the current need and how could this be preventative the next time there's a major crisis.
Thanks, Sarah. We have another question. You talked about with Diane's testimony tomorrow that one guest will be, it's an affected tenant who will be testifying tomorrow. So someone has asked, how can other affected tenants or renters participate in testimonies and future testimonies?
That's a good question. So this individual was invited by the committee to testify. I'm not sure how they identified this particular tenant, but we know that other committees typically work through other partner organizations like NLHC or like other organizations to identify folks. Keep in mind, any impacted person can always participate in these hearings by either submitting their own testimony. Even if you're not invited, you can just submit it. We can help you do that. Or you can be using this opportunity, so using the hearing to engage with your members of Congress and to highlight the connection between the hearing and your personal experience. We know that sharing personal stories is really one of the best ways to motivate members of Congress and move them from being an opponent to maybe someone who's neutral, to somebody who's a supporter, to someone who's a champion. And so it's really important that everyone is using their voice in whatever way that they can to lift up those stories and to share them.
That's great. Thank you, Sarah. And the last question is there any new intel on more moderate Senate Ds like Manchin or Sinema supporting the $3.5 trillion reconciliation bill?
I don't know. And this is one of these really sticky and intriguing questions that's happening in politics right now. A lot of us, including myself, want to see this bipartisan bill, like either they fish and cut bait, like let's get the bill done or not and move on. But part of allowing these conversations to happen is what's necessary to get Manchin and Sinema on board. They've said generally that they're okay with, well, I'll say Manchin has said that he is okay in general with moving forward on reconciliation, but is leaving plenty of caveats in case he doesn't like the content. He's especially concerned about some of the climate change provisions. Not surprising since he's from a coal producing state. Sinema has been a little bit more quiet. I haven't seen any indication from her one way or the other whether she would support a budget reconciliation bill. I haven't seen anything specific on housing either. So for folks who are in Arizona and in West Virginia, you have your work cut out for you to be continuing to engage with them and explain to them why this is so important.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And I did say that was the last question, but this actually, the next one is, someone wants to know, is there a fan club for Sarah? Because they're very appreciative of your efficient reports and saying that you're very thorough. So thank you, Sarah, for sharing all the details.
My pleasure, thank you.
Indeed. All right, so that actually brings us to the end of today's call. We'll post the call on our website, and you'll also receive an email with all the links and information that we shared today. So stay tuned for that. And we have a number of working groups scheduled throughout the week. So in this email that you will receive, it'll have links to those working groups as well. But thank you again for joining us today for the conversation, and we look forward to seeing you next week. Take care, everyone.